So, welcome to something that I've not really done before, but it's also not completely unrelated to past content on the channel, because this is going to be regarding the upcoming Total War game, Total War 3 Kingdoms, and it's going to be a bit of an informal musing, really, and ultimately answering the question of whether I think it will actually be good or not. And this is a rather interesting thing, because the quality of Total War games tends to go through peaks and troughs quite a lot, both in terms of objective, measurable things, and more subjective qualities as well. So with this in mind, it shouldn't really come as too much of a surprise that the responses so far have been kind of mixed, ranging from the overwhelmingly positive to the overwhelmingly negative, depending on where you look. And some of those points will also be making their way into the relevant portions of the video, but we'll be starting off with a little bit of a preamble about CA themselves and how their recent performance may impact Three Kingdoms, and then we'll move on to some of the positives that I have noted about the game so far, of which there are quite a few, and then there are also some concerns which both I have and also concerns which I may not necessarily share, but ones that I have seen commonly spoken of around the internet based on various reactions, and then we will sum it all up at the end to sort of combine what I think and also what I think other people will think based on what it is they are looking for out of a new historical Total War title. So when determining whether something being made is indeed going to be good or not when it's finished, you have to start off with the people making it. So Creative Assembly, the game developer responsible for Total War, and they're kind of interesting really, because while it's not unheard of for a development studio to sort of focus in on one series in particular, the fact that Creative Assembly have managed to survive making primarily what is RTS games, real-time strategies, whereas most sort of RTS series have either fallen away or been bastardized. You only have to look at Command and Conquer to see what fate could await a potential series like this. But they have focused mainly on Total War since the turn of the millennium, way back since Shogun 1. They've been making Total War games, but that's not the only series that they have made. They've also made more recently another strategy game, Halo Wars 2, which came out in 2017. But one game that does stick out a little bit from most of their others is Alien Isolation in 2014, which obviously was more of a sort of survival horror game, which was certainly very different to anything they had made before, and it certainly does stand out in the list of their games. And most development studios, such as Creative Assemblies, with the relative size that they are, ultimately usually have someone pulling the strings, a game publisher, and in this case it is Sega. And for most of the questionable business decisions that CA have been making more recently with regards to their DLC policies, it's a pretty safe bet that Sega are the ones behind that. After all, they do control the money that comes in and out, and obviously they want to maximise their profits as much as possible, just like any publisher. To be honest, as far as publishers go, it could be worse, but it could also be a lot better, so kind of a middle ground in terms of how terrible it could be, to be honest. But CA themselves are not entirely they haven't got an entirely clean slate with regards to what they've been doing lately. There have been a few more concerning moves that they've been making. They have made obviously some mobile games, well, a mobile game at the moment in Total War Arena, and although I think Alien Blackout is actually going to be developed by someone else. But regardless, the move to mobile is always something that's going to be a little bit... people are always going to view that with a little bit of suspicion. Again, I don't believe that that's entirely CA doing that. I believe that Sega are obviously going to be pushing for more mobile games because it is such a fertile market for more profits. But even so, I believe even if it were just CA on their own, I believe they would find the money that mobile offers a little bit too hard to resist. So we'll see how far they delve into the mobile market. Also, something else which people picked up on recently was the controversy surrounding the Rome 2 sort of making female generals a lot more prominent, and the dialogue surrounding that from both people complaining about it and people supporting it, and then from CA themselves, has been rather inflammatory, which is never really a good thing, because if you sort of throw your hat into that ring and try to fight that battle, it's not one that can be won, regardless of sort of what your stance is on it. If you start getting involved with that, you're always going to alienate someone, you're always going to kick up a fuss, and it's not really going to translate too well when it comes to your business. But we'll see. There have been a few things in Three Kingdoms marketing which have sort of suggested a sort of similar vein here. But again, it's kind of hard to tell with the promotional material, because obviously they will mostly try to show their games in as positive a light as possible. But obviously it was really in the Zhengjiang trailer that people have sort of noticed that start to creep back in. And obviously, again, we'll get on to the more aggressive DLC policies a little bit later in the video, but obviously the Yellow Turban Rebellion certainly is a black mark against Creative Assembly as well, in a similar vein to how the Chaos Warriors were. But that's just par for the course at this point, and I would mostly blame Sega, but obviously, you know, it's kind of hard to tell them apart at this point. So when considering some of the more positive looking aspects of the upcoming game, I won't be going through absolutely everything, of course, but I will be going through the main things that have leapt out at me as looking particularly promising regarding the game. And this is also not just going to be coming from my own perspective, but also what seems to be the general consensus on a few things. Obviously I will be interspersing my own view throughout this as well. But we'll start off with the setting, actually, and I'm actually honestly quite surprised that Creative Assembly has not made a game in the Three Kingdoms period of China before, because it would seem to be pretty much the ideal fit for a Total War game like this, and in particular with some of the mechanical choices that they have made. Certainly it seems to fit with what they were going for here, particularly with some of the more heavier character focus that it looks like they're going for. Obviously there's a lot of well-known generals and rulers in that period which fit that mould very, very well. There were, of course, before Three Kingdoms was announced, there were a few alternatives that people were looking at. In particular, I think the Victorian Total War was one of the things that people were looking at as looking quite likely before Three Kingdoms was announced, and that would have obviously entailed a return to like Empire Total War and Napoleon Total War style of sort of guns and line infantry and gunpowder and all of that sort of thing, which, you know, as there are some people that really do like those games. Not my cup of tea per se, but there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously that is more of a subjective thing than an objective one. But yeah, there was also, I heard slight rumours of potential something like Meso and Native American one, which that would have been quite out there, and actually a Mesoamerican Total War would be something I'd be super interested in if they ever did that. But it is a little bit more niche, perhaps a little bit more risky from a business standpoint. You know, maybe a Saga game of that in that part of the world might be more likely to come out, because obviously those tend to be a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter on the investment. But yeah, I think overall the Three Kingdoms period of China was definitely the right choice for this game, considering the mechanical choices and also just the fact that it's a very interesting period in general. It's got a lot of potential from a Total War perspective to be very interesting indeed. And the next point, which I've technically already made, is the fact that this is going to be Creative Assembly's first full historical title in 5 years. You know, Attila has been out for quite a long time at this point, and that was their last full historical release. Since then we've had 2 full Warhammer games and the Saga game Thrones of Britannia, which was, in all honesty, basically Attila just dressed up, as I said before. And a lot of people have been really looking forward to CA's next historical title, which does obviously put a bit more pressure on the game to actually be good. A repeat of Rome 2 is absolutely not what is called for here. And I feel as though, just in general, people have been looking for a game of similar sort of quality to Shogun 2 for quite some time now from Creative Assembly, and I feel as though Three Kingdoms does represent the potential to do that. It has the potential to be even better as well, in my opinion, with all of the advances that have been made since Shogun 2 came out. But I feel as though Shogun 2 has not really been topped in a historical sense since it came out. Obviously, before that there's some sort of debate out about what the best Total War game is, but Shogun 2 is one that sort of enters into that discussion, and I feel as though there's no reason why Three Kingdoms can. But yeah, it has been quite a long wait since the last full historical title, and while Thrones of Britannia was not a bad game, it was also not the sort of full-on experience that I think a lot of people were hoping it could have been. There was a little bit lighter on content, shall we say. There were some good things that it did, but I feel as though Three Kingdoms now, particularly with some of the promotional stuff that they've released, it definitely has the potential to be a complete experience, and after this long waiting for a new historical title, it certainly needs to be. So something that I feel as though some people might be a little bit more wary of, but something that I certainly think can only improve the game if it's done correctly, is a greater focus on the characters involved. You know, even, again, I've used Shogun 2 as a bit of an example, and I will continue to do so throughout the game, but any of the past historical Total War games, really, all of the factions could feel a little bit samey, you know, and to take Shogun 2 as an example, you know, all of the daimyos that you would interact with on the diplomacy screen would have the same voice actor, they would all look very similar, the only difference really would be the colour of their armour and their helmet, which, you know, could lead to a little bit, you know, it could get very samey when you were sort of interacting with these clans and factions, and obviously it's the same story for the most part in other historical titles as well. One thing that Warhammer certainly did quite well, in my opinion, was sort of differentiating the factions and making it a little bit more interesting to interact with other people. And Three Kingdoms looks like it's actually going to go even further in that direction by sort of having it, it has been described as sort of a soap opera that plays out while sort of you're going about your business of conquering your way to become the Emperor of China. I would be interested to see how far this goes, because obviously it's not just you as the player character, the warlord you're playing as, which is involved in this. There's also going to be AI sort of warlords and officers under you, and I wonder how much autonomy they will actually have, how much free will of their own they will actually sort of exhibit, because that could be a sort of a space where they could really start to be a bit creative. You could sort of convince sort of lower ranking officers from other factions to defect. The same thing could happen to you if your sort of underlings are not too happy with you. And this is the sort of thing which I feel as though does have a lot of potential, but again, they haven't really gone into too much detail on that. But from the current position that we're in, I can certainly feel that this is something which can only improve the game if it's done correctly, and if it's not done at the expense of anything else, which of course they haven't gone into a great detail of yet. Something which they have gone into a fair amount of detail on, though, going as far as to release 2 full-length videos on the subject, is the new diplomacy system, which Total War has needed for quite a while at this point. The diplomacy system in Total Wars has always been kind of pointless, in my opinion. Frustrating at worst, but mostly it's just something that's there that, for the most part, in most Total War games previously, I've tried to interact with the diplomacy screen as little as I possibly could, just so that I didn't have to bother with it. And I would just sort of build up an army as strong as I possibly could and then just crush everyone through martial might, rather than trying to go about anything diplomatically, because the AI was very rigid in their diplomacy tactics, and oftentimes it would always feel like you as the player would have the deck stacked against you, which, in order to try and make up for the AI's deficiencies and trying to make it harder for you to game the system, that kind of had to be true. But at the same time, it encouraged gaming the system, because that was the only way to really get what you wanted out of any sort of diplomacy deal. Early on, you would set up a bunch of trade deals, and then sort of one by one they would become irrelevant as you became an economic superpower, and then you could just crush everyone through sheer strength of arms, and that wasn't really particularly interesting. But this new diplomacy system looks far better, and I would certainly say that it is definitely going to be at least an improvement on what there was before. Based on what they've shown as well, it should actually be good. In particular, the idea of building sort of coalitions and then full alliances is pretty interesting. I feel as though a lot could be done with that, because also, not just from a player perspective, where you can obviously join coalitions, join alliances, head them up, but I feel as though this is also a good sort of measure for the AI to also be able to keep pace with you into the late game, because obviously when you reached a certain point in old Total War games, I'm sure that will still be the same in Three Kingdoms, when you reached a certain strength you were completely unstoppable. The AI would not be able to hold a candle to you, but particularly from the transition into the mid to late game, I feel as though this diplomacy system could also help the AI in sort of building coalitions and alliances against the player, so that it didn't become just a case of steamrolling absolutely everyone. The only peril you would tend to face in old Total War games would be in the early to very early mid-game. As soon as you got sort of established in the mid-game, there was really nothing that could sort of stop you, provided you had built up correctly, and it was kind of difficult to build up in a way that was incorrect, to be honest with you. So yeah, this new diplomacy system is, I feel as though the fact that they've advertised it a lot speaks well about how proud they are of it, and also it shows that they knew really that they needed to overhaul it. And I feel as though in combination with the greater character focus, this could be one of the main strengths of the game. So something that I wasn't expecting when Three Kingdoms was announced was to have 11 playable factions and warlords. I felt for sure that we would be getting closer to the 5 or 6 mark with the 3 main ones, then maybe Yuan Shao, Dongjua, and the Yellow Turban Rebellion in addition to that. But yeah, I mean, more variety is always a good thing. Being able to sort of choose your start position on the map and sort of having different experiences every time you play, always going to be a good thing. And even the huge variety that Warhammer offers only started off with 4 playable factions plus 1 DLC faction. So yeah, big props to CA for actually making a wide range of factions playable. And obviously some people may be saying, well, that's fairly easy, but with the new character focus it may not have been so easy, because you have to make every sort of faction have their own sort of sense of identity. All of their officers need to have their own sense of personality as well. So again, that is something else that I'm looking forward to playing, sort of experiencing the game from many different perspectives. And I would also imagine that post-release there will be a couple more that get added as well. Again, there's a potential downside to that as well, which we'll get onto in just a second. But yeah, I feel as though, again, this is something which plays into the character focus a bit more as well, because obviously it will imply a little bit more variety from that perspective as well. Again, it feeds into the diplomacy system, so all of the strengths that I've mentioned so far do interact with one another very well, or at least in theory they should interact with each other very well. Obviously we won't know for sure until the game actually releases and we start seeing some reviews, but we'll see. For now, I certainly can't fault the fact that there are far more playable factions that are going to be available than I thought there were. Something which CA have added as well, a new feature which is coming for Three Kingdoms, which may have been born out of necessity because they wanted to appease some of the fans of the more classic series, is the fact that there will be two play modes, one romance play mode and one records play mode. So romance of the Three Kingdoms and records of the Three Kingdoms, and this refers to whether or not there will be hero units on the field. So obviously in the romance version it will be kind of more similar to the Warhammer style of things, where your commanding officer and potentially one or two others will be single entity unit models which have some very powerful abilities and obviously have a lot of health, so they can't be taken down as easily as a standard unit model, but obviously their strengths will vary depending on the type of hero that there are, of which there are 5, which again, that's a decent amount of variety there as well, and obviously more variety is always a good thing. But if that's not your bag, because I know that a lot of people were kind of not really into Warhammer because of that aspect of things, obviously sort of giant monsters and sort of individual hero units managing to sort of plough their way through entire sections of an army. If that's not your bag, then you will have the records mode to play with, which will be sort of more akin to a classic Total War, where your general will not be a single unit entity and instead be put into a sort of higher tier bodyguard unit, I would imagine, or at least a bodyguard unit of some description, and they would sort of be a sort of unit based on that. I would still hope, based on the higher character focus, that they do something similar to Thrones of Britannia in the records mode, where your general cannot die if there are, I think, 70% of the unit is still alive. Or no, wait, it was if 70% of your unit had died, the general's bodyguard unit had died, then the general would be allowed to die. And this sort of comes into the fact that in the early game of the campaign, if you charge in your general, because obviously you kind of need to use your general when there are so few units available to you early on, you really don't want your faction leader to be skewered just on the off chance when you charge in. That can be incredibly frustrating, and all it does is lead people to save scum. You know, especially early on, if you don't have an heir as well, it's pretty much campaign over at that point, so of course you're not going to stick around for that. So I would hope that there are some systems like that in play where it can't screw you over too much, but by the same token, I do understand why people don't really feel as though the romance version of the game will be for them, and they will go for the records version because they want a little bit more of a sort of realistic historical feel to it, especially after the over the top nature of the two Warhammer games. They'll be going into this hoping for a little bit more of a sort of grounded feeling to it. Personally, I think the first campaign I'll certainly be playing on the Romance of the Three Kingdoms mode, but I will certainly check out the Records mode as well. Both of these two, I think the fact that CA has put time into trying to sort of make everyone happy with this game and sort of make all of the fans that they have happy after the Warhammer games and after the old historical titles speaks of their awareness as well as a company, because they could very easily have just ploughed right ahead with just the romance mode and left the records mode out completely, and this obviously would have disappointed quite a few people, and it would have also netted them quite a lot of stick, and making 2 whole game modes for a game does take up quite a lot of time and resources, so they do deserve credit for that. Again, there is a potential downside to this which we will get onto a little later, but just the fact that they have these 2 modes and they have dedicated time to building both of them is a good thing. So the final strength that I'm going to mention here is the sense of detail, the attention to detail that I've sort of gleaned from the promotional material thus far in the trailers and in the sort of the gameplay reveals as well. I feel as though, you know, the soundtrack is one good example of that. I think the soundtrack is sounding pretty fantastic as well and could honestly be listed as a strength all of its own. But just the translations to the soundtrack, and obviously the fact that most of them I think were written by one of the in-game generals, Cao Cao, as well, that's a pretty neat thing. And also just, you know, one particular detail which stood out in the trailers was in the Sun Jian trailer, where the Imperial seal has the corner missing where it was restored with gold, which again, it just shows that CA has done their homework on this time period and are looking to put in a good sense of detail into the game, which is always going to be a nice accompaniment to a game about a historical period. But yeah, that's really the main strengths that I've noticed so far about the game through the promotional material. Obviously, again, we won't really know how good any of these strengths are until we actually start seeing reviews and until we start playing it ourselves. But all of those things are looking very promising. There are, however, some concerns linked to some of those strengths, and also some which sort of stand all on their own. Some of these concerns are going to be ones which I share, some of them which I don't, but a lot of the community have voiced as well. So I will be going through a few of the main sort of more negative aspects that people have raised with regards to Three Kingdoms so far, and then we'll follow that up with a summary on what I think. So now we come to what may very well be the most significant section of the video, and that is going to be the concerns that many people, including myself for some of them, have for the upcoming game. And it's kind of easy to look at the promotional material for a game and pick out the good things, and obviously in this case I've already mentioned quite a few of the things that look pretty good from the trailers and some of the gameplay reveals that they've done, but there are a few things that you can pick out as being maybe a little bit more worth scrutinizing. And also it's worth saying that some of the concerns that I'm going to be mentioning are not necessarily anything to do with just the the marketing that's been done for the game already, but will be more general concerns that CA's past form have sort of made people a little bit more wary of. And speaking of which, we'll get on to the first concern, which I have, and I'm sure that a few other people have, and while it may be slightly unlikely to actually materialise, it is, will it be a technical disaster like Rome 2 was? Total War games have got a bit of a spotty history when it comes to their launches. Oftentimes there are several things which do need to be addressed on launches. However, I feel as though the Warhammer games in particular have actually launched fairly stably. However, Rome 2 obviously launched in a completely disastrous form, and Attila as well has got some really poor optimization issues, which obviously anyone who follows Total War will be very much aware of the fact that Attila runs like a bit of a pig on most systems. You really need to have a very beefy system indeed to really try and juice the graphics and sort of the effectiveness of the game as a whole, as far as it will go. I personally don't believe it will be as bad as Rome 2 on release. I would certainly hope not anyway, and I would hope for it to be better than Attila as well, particularly with regards to the optimization. But there is always the possibility and the danger that this sort of thing could happen again with this game. Moving on to something a little bit more tangible though, something which has been noticed, particularly in the more recent gameplay reveal in the ambush for Sun Ren, was the animations and the fact that they don't seem to be as well synced with one another as they perhaps could be. And what I mean by that is there's several instances within the trailer where you can see sort of unit models swinging and not really hitting anything but still dealing damage. Now I do believe there is a reason for this, but this is obviously bad for a very obvious reason, that it looks kind of weird for sort of units to be swinging into thin air and still dealing damage. But if you think back to Attila, they have this system in place where the animations are synced up and individual unit models will sort of enter into 1v1s. You will never see a 2v1 fight happening in Attila because essentially, unit models will fight each other 1 versus 1. However, in Attila and any of its subsidiary mods that have come out, in particular I'll be using Medieval Kingdoms 1212 as an example here, it could lead to some mechanical issues depending on how you want to categorise it. For example, I did actually post a replay of Medieval 1212 not too long ago, just before the turn of the new year, and my Bohemian Macemen went up against a sort of group of late period Hungarian swordsmen, which in terms of classifications of units, they're both shielded heavy infantry and they are both of the same period in history, so the late period. So you'd expect them to trade relatively evenly, but you would give the statistical advantage certainly to the Macemen. However, the Macemen got 150 kills, the late period Hungarian swordsmen got less than 10. And this is something which I believe happened in no small part due to the fact that Attila, when two units fight one another, the individual unit models are locked into these 1v1s, and the Macemen are better than the late period Hungarian swordsmen, so they slaughtered them. Now, this does lead to this sort of question to be asked, like, if I were to sort of choose between good synced up animations properly and sort of mechanical, sort of how good it feels to play mechanically, I would choose the mechanical the mechanical side of things. So if this was a straight choice and CA literally can't make the animations look any better than they did in the Sunren trailer, then I would say, you know, I would take the mechanical benefits over the animations. However, they really should be able to sync up the animations a little bit better than was shown in that trailer, to be honest. And it's certainly not an unreasonable expectation, I think, to expect both of these things, both good animations and a little bit, sort of, the mechanics to be a little bit stronger than they were in Attila, because I really was never a fan of that whole 1v1 deal that they had going on. I did mention Medieval 2 in that last little section, and the next potential concern which a lot of people have been sort of showcasing about Total War in general for some time is not unrelated to Medieval 2, I think, because it is the pace of the fights and how quick they tend to be. Now obviously I've posted up a lot of Medieval 2 content, or at least Medieval 2 mod content, and one thing that is quite clear is the fights are fairly long. You know, they last quite a long time, especially when you add more players to the mix. Even 1v1s tend to last closer to 20 minutes. And when you obviously scale that up, it's not uncommon for matches to last, you know, over an hour. However, ever since then, the pace of Total War games outside of the sort of gunnery-based series of Napoleon and Empire has shortened. It's become a lot faster. You know, this is a critique which many people have even of Shogun 2, which is widely beloved. The fact that battles tend to be over very, very quickly. And a lot of people were kind of hoping that with a new historical Total War title, that they would kind of reverse the decisions that they've been making ever since Shogun 2 and, you know, even Rome 2 and Attila. Their battles tend to be a little bit more brutal, a little bit quicker than the likes of the older titles like Medieval 2. Honestly, I think based on the sort of success that Warhammer has had and based on the fact that they're going to be using a lot of the same tech from their most recent titles, I think that it was always kind of unlikely that they were going to change the pace of the fights overly. And it would seem, certainly on the Romance mode, but I imagine it's going to be very similar on the Records mode as well, that the pace of the fights are going to be relatively quick. So, again, this isn't really a positive or a negative for me. As long as the gameplay is good, either way I'm happy. But a lot of people, I think, were hoping for the fights to be a little bit longer, a little bit more meat to them, and it does not look like that is going to be the case based on what we've seen so far. And speaking of changes to the newer titles, which people have been perhaps a little bit more sceptical of, Hero Generals are back in Three Kingdoms, just like they were in Warhammer, and for Warhammer I suppose many people were sort of willing to let it slide a little bit, because obviously it's a fantasy setting, not really grounded in reality. However, this is a historical title, and so for Hero Generals to be a thing here is perhaps a little bit surprising for some people, because I think most people from the newest historical title would probably be expecting sort of, again, a return to a more grounded feeling, but that feeling may be skewed somewhat when you see Lu Bu sort of wading his way through legions of peasants, getting thousands of kills all by himself. However, I think that maybe people are probably over-exaggerating how strong the hero units really are. I mean, even in Warhammer, it's not too difficult to kill some of the squishier heroes, and even some of the stronger ones, you can't afford to just do whatever you please with them. If you put them into a situation where they are more vulnerable, they are going to get killed off very, very quickly. And I feel as though, again, this is just, they wanted to go the heroes route, I think, because they actually quite liked the mechanics of it from Warhammer, and also because it meshed very well with the new character focus, and it obviously fits well with the setting. So, like I said back in the sort of positive section, it does fit the game to have these hero units. However, I can also understand why some people are a little bit, you know, they were hoping for a little bit less fantasy in their historical game. But again, I feel as though this is the sort of thing which can be like a complete deal breaker for some people. Like, it, you know, knowing now that there are hero units in the game, you know, they just won't play it. However, the fact that the Records mode does exist does at least show that Creative Assembly is aware of this sort of potential banana skin that they've placed in front of themselves, and they're trying their best to sort of appeal to all of their fans, which is commendable. However, speaking of which, there is another sort of potential concern which people may have, including myself actually. This is one of the more real concerns that I have based on the Records mode itself, and that is how much attention will the Records mode actually receive. The fact that they are developing this sort of more historical mode is sort of very commendable in many ways. However, how much developmental attention will it actually get? Because based on everything we've seen so far, the Romance mode looks to be mechanically sound and balanced fairly well. You know, again, they've only shown us a couple of battles, so it's kind of difficult to judge how that will work on a macro scale with a lot of these sort of hero units running around. However, it's very difficult to balance a game like this in a way which is sort of, that makes sense. they're essentially going to have to balance two separate games, because it's not simply enough to take the heroes out of the game and just bung in a high tier sort of general's bodyguard cavalry unit and expect things to be balanced exactly the same way. So I would be very interested to see if the Records mode actually does receive the same developmental attention that the Romance mode and all of the different heroes with all of their different mechanics will, and whether or not every hero will then just become the same, or whether or not they will still retain some of their individuality. That's another question that needs to be asked. Yeah, I do feel as though the Records mode will be more bare bones than the Romance mode, which is one of the reasons why I'm almost certain I'll be playing the Romance mode first, because I just feel as though with all of the heroes that they've put into the game as it stands, it's almost a no-brainer really that the Records mode will not have been developed as much as the Romance mode, which obviously some people, like I just said, you know, the fact that people were hoping for a new full historical title to return to a more grounded feeling, and obviously they will then go for the Records mode, they may very well feel a little bit disappointed if they are then receiving a lesser experience than one that has not received the attention in terms of mechanics and balancing that those who are playing the Romance mode will get. And this is a legitimate concern. It's actually one of, I think, the most legitimate concerns that many people have sort of raised with CA. But time will tell. I feel as though what would really sort of set many people's mind at ease is if they released a gameplay video on a battle that was using the Records mode, which would be, you know, that would be a good move, considering they've already shown to show off some of their new features with regards to diplomacy and the Romance mode. So yeah, we'll see, I guess. You know, personally, I do feel as though the Records mode will be more bare bones, as I said, but CA are certainly more than welcome to prove me wrong. Earlier I said how more variety was always a good thing, and that having 11 playable factions in the game was certainly very commendable, but tied into that is, will the factions actually have significant differences between them? You know, in order to sort of really hammer home this sort of diversity between the factions, it would then be a real shame if you got into the game and all of them maintained basically the same armies with a couple of exceptions. Now, even if this is true, it's not a complete deal breaker, because obviously, once again, another comparison to Shogun 2 can be made. Very few of the clans felt noticeably different. You could certainly say that maybe the Iko-Iki and the Otomo felt very different to a lot of the other clans, and perhaps even the Asuji as well. But ultimately, a lot of the Shogun 2 clans played very similar. You know, they had a couple of unique units here and there to sort of expand their roster a little bit. And that is honestly kind of what I'm expecting for Three Kingdoms as well, which, considering the enormous variety between the armies in Warhammer, I still maintain a little bit of hope, honestly, that Three Kingdoms will have sort of very diverse rosters between the factions, giving even more reason to replay the game. However, I am kind of expecting something a little bit closer to Shogun 2. Maybe a little bit more variety than Shogun 2, but also based on the fact that all of the sort of generals are going to have their own differences, their own traits and quirks and characteristics, that may very well be what CA is banking on to deliver the versatility, which will sort of then engender a lot more playthroughs from people willing to replay the game. But yeah, I do hope that this is a concern which ultimately ends up being unfounded, because I do like variety between factions in games. It's one of the things which sort of ultimately it is the reason my channel started, because I started doing faction overviews for the standard Third Age mod for Medieval 2. So I do hope that there is sort of a decent variety between the factions, so that I can actually do some faction overviews for Three Kingdoms, and it doesn't just come down to me speaking about the officers. But again, it's one of those things that we're just going to have to wait and see, because they haven't shown us like all that much in terms of the unit rosters just yet. You know, they've shown us the diplomacy system in a few battles, and that's pretty much it. They've also revealed quite a lot of the actual characters and officers that are going to be in the game, but not a great deal in terms of the actual army units and the differences between the factions that we can expect. A concern which I don't necessarily agree with, but it has been repeated enough for me to sort of warrant repeating it here as well, and that is that a lot of people say it looks like a mobile game, which I think is kind of an unfair assumption to make, considering that Total War games in general tend to be ones which tax your PC quite a lot. You know, and obviously they're not the sort of games which will run on a mobile device, at least not yet. You know, Total War Arena was a very different kind of game to a full-scale title, because there were a lot less in terms of the units sort of on the battlefield, and a lot less in terms of what you were controlling. You could only control 3 units at a time, whereas obviously it's a very different kettle of fish when you're controlling a whole army, and obviously you scale the unit, scaling up to maximum. You And this is where the optimization issue could come in again, because obviously if it's poor optimization, then obviously the game's performance is going to suffer even on the best of PCs, just like Attila. But again, from a UI perspective, from a visual perspective, I personally don't see it, but again, a lot of people have said it, so it is worth repeating here. So we'll see. I mean, I would assume, based on what I've seen so far, that the game is going to look just fine. It's not going to be a huge step up. I think it's probably going to be about equal to Total Warhammer 2 in terms of visual fidelity, but to be honest, that's fine with me. The Total Warhammer 2 looked pretty damn good as it was. We'll see, obviously, Total Warhammer is able to sort of bank on a lot of the theatre of all of the over-the-top action and monsters and magic that was flying around. But I have faith in CA to make a decent-looking game, and I feel as though the UI isn't overly mobile either. The unit portraits down at the bottom, maybe they're a little bit bigger than normal, and that may be what people are talking about. But yeah, I mean, again, it's one of the things that we'll see, I guess. And now we come to the business model for Total War games, and in particular, how aggressive is the DLC going to be for Three Kingdoms? Because I've actually praised Warhammer a fair amount throughout this video in terms of the comparisons between it and Three Kingdoms, but one area in which I really can't praise it too much really is how aggressive the DLC structure is, because there is tons of DLC content for Warhammer. And for Total War in general, there's a lot of DLC that comes out for it. Again, a lot of people have said that Total War Saga Thrones of Britannia is basically a glorified expansion pack for Attila that they just sold separately, and honestly it's hard to disagree with that. They changed enough mechanically and sort of in the style of the game to sort of get away with that slightly, but that is certainly a criticism that can be made. They were still producing DLC for Rome 2, which is an old game, and credit to them for sticking with something which was so universally panned at release. But yeah, I would be interested to see how Three Kingdoms handles its DLC structure. I would say that it's probably not as easy to just sort of throw anything out like it was for Warhammer. Obviously, Warhammer have got a lot of different races that they can do mechanically, a lot of different legendary lords. Not quite so easy with Three Kingdoms, although there are options. Like, I would fully expect, I don't think Dongzhuo is going to be playable on release, interestingly enough, so I would probably expect him to make an appearance as a DLC character at some point, maybe even free DLC, depending on how generous Sega wants to be. But I would also expect other things like maybe the Nan Man, the Shu Southern campaigns. Obviously, anyone who's played Dynasty Warriors will know who that is, which also opens the door to stuff like Elephant Cavalry, so I would almost certainly expect a bit of that. Different time periods as well. The rise of Sima Yi might be something that we see in the future as well. We'll see. I would expect, to be fair, a fairly aggressive DLC strategy like most things, because that has been sort of the bread and butter of what Total War has done more recently. And actually, I did total up the total for all of the Warhammer DLC. If you wanted to get the complete experience from Warhammer 2 with all of the factions, campaigns and legendary lords, and you wanted to pay for everything individually, that would be £89.90, and in dollars that would be $114.96, which is fairly hefty, all things considered. And that's for the DLC alone. That isn't including the cost of the base games. So again, it's one of those things, and obviously to tie into that, you could say Sega. I mean, for the most part, I don't really ascribe most of that sort of very aggressive business strategy to CA as such. I don't know whether they would still be doing it if Sega wasn't lording over them. They might, I might be giving them too much credit here. Everyone's heads are turned by a lot of money after all. But yeah, we'll see how generous Sega are willing to be, because they obviously sort of make all of the major business decisions, and we'll see what gets chopped out. I mean, the Yellow Turbans have already been chopped out to be released as sort of a pre-order incentive, and I'll fall for it because I'm a schmuck, but there you go. I mean, the business strategy, we'll see how bad it gets. So obviously there are more concerns that people have raised, but these I would say are probably the main ones / the ones most likely to actually materialise in terms of the risk they pose to the actual game itself. And how much sort of importance you ascribe to each one is really up to personal taste. Like, again, a lot of people sort of really get a bee in their bonnet about sort of the business model of a game, and if they don't agree with it heavily, then they will refuse to support the product, and that's absolutely fine. And other people will sort of pay more attention to how the mechanics are developing. Like a lot of people obviously were hoping for a return to perhaps some of the earlier Total War titles, which it doesn't look like that's going to be the case, so those people will probably give this game a miss, which again is fine. And a lot of these concerns are very valid, to be fair. CA has been one of those weird developers in the past where sometimes they'll produce something fantastic, other times they'll produce something not so fantastic. We'll see what Three Kingdoms has in store, though. I personally am fairly optimistic that a lot of these risks will not materialise, but you never can tell looking from the outside in like this. So, to bring it back round to the question at the top of the video, will Total War Three Kingdoms be good? And this is rather a subjective thing, because it will depend really on how you view some of the changes in some of the more recent games. I believe if you liked Shogun 2 or the Warhammer games, then I believe that you will like Total War Three Kingdoms, and I believe you will think it will be good. However, if you were hoping for a return to something like Medieval 2 or even Rome 1, I kind of feel as though you felt as though you were going to be disappointed anyway, and I believe you will be disappointed. I don't believe you'll like it if that is the case. But do I think it will be good? I have high hopes for Three Kingdoms, in spite of some of the more questionable aspects surrounding it, like the animations, like some of the marketing, like some of the already quite aggressive DLC sort of pushing with the Yellow Turban Rebellion. I do believe that fundamentally it has a lot of potential to be a really good game. Now, it can be derailed, both from a business standpoint and from a PR perspective, based on Sega and CA together. But provided they don't put their foot in their mouths too often, and provided they don't get too greedy, I do believe that Total War Three Kingdoms actually has the potential to be my personal favourite Total War of all time. But obviously that is very dependent on a few outside factors, so we shall see. But ultimately, yes, I do think it will be good. But again, we won't have to wait too long. You know, spring is getting ever closer, and that is when Total War Three Kingdoms is going to release. So I hope you found this somewhat interesting, just to hear my perspectives as someone who's played Total War for a little while at this point. And you know, this is a format which could make a return for other games as well. I'm not really sure. Again, it does need a little bit of work. Obviously, it's a little bit rough around the edges. I'm not really used to doing this sort of thing. But I did feel as though something a little bit different would be called for. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.